our allies are very interested in Canadian LNG.
Imagine a world where America's most reliable ally suddenly decides to go its own way. A country that Washington has come to regard as a junior partner is no longer willing to play by someone else's rules. Behind the scenes of loud statements and television scandals, a deal is being made that could change the global balance of power. This is no small matter. The sum involved is $175 billion. The scale is an entire era, and the consequences threaten the very foundation of the North American alliance that has existed for almost 80 years.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs has been having, the Minister of International Trade has been having, the conversations I've been having.
Americans are used to thinking that their northern neighbor will always be there, supplying oil and gas, providing territory for military bases, supporting every initiative from Washington. But everything has changed. While the world's press was focused on internal scandals and election battles, documents were being signed in Europe that could turn the familiar order into dust. What had seemed unshakable since World War II began to crack at the seams.
What I can tell you from the conversations that the Prime Minister has been having.
At the center of the story is a project that has been given the grandiose name Golden Dome by the White House. Officially, it is supposed to protect North America from hypersonic missiles. In reality, however, it threatens to tie Canada permanently to the American security system, turning it into a hostage of the Pentagon. But it is precisely this scenario that Ottawa has rebelled against. The decision to withdraw from the project was the first step towards the most dramatic geopolitical restructuring in the region's history.
You would see a rolling set of announcements over the fall as different projects mature and meet the criteria.
Think about it. For decades, the Canadian Navy depended on foreign second-hand ships, and now modern submarine technology from Europe is on the horizon. This is not just a purchase of weapons. It was a symbol of breaking old dependencies. And when you add to this new gas routes leading not south to the United States, but east and west to Europe and Asia, it becomes clear that we are on the verge of a tectonic shift.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
The U.S. found itself in a position for which it was clearly unprepared. For decades, its oil refining and gas infrastructure has been built for supplies from the north. Millions of American homes are heated with Canadian fuel. What will happen if this flow decreases? Experts warn of rising energy prices, power outages, and blows to industry. But most importantly, there would be a loss of political control over a neighbor that, for the first time in many decades, has declared we can do it ourselves. And now a question arises, the answer to which will determine the future not only of North America, but of the entire world. What will happen if the United States' closest ally decides to break the invisible chains and turn to Europe? How will Washington, accustomed to dictating the rules of the game, react? Can America afford to lose its monopoly in the Arctic and the energy sector, on which its entire economic power has been based?
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
This story is not about distant theory or diplomatic minutiae. It concerns everyone. Because if the alliance that has held the world order together since World War II collapses, then changes are coming that will be felt in New York, Berlin, Moscow, and Seoul. And the question is no longer whether the world will change. The question is whether we are ready for these changes. America has always believed that its northern neighbor would remain in its familiar role as a supplier of resources and a predictable military ally. Since 1940, since the Ogdensburg Agreement, Canada has been effectively integrated into the collective defense system led by Washington. Since then, every major military project in Ottawa has been filtered through the Pentagon, and every initiative has been linked in one way or another to American interests. This dependence has become so familiar that it has almost gone unnoticed. But it was precisely Washington's habit and self-confidence that led it to fail to notice how control was beginning to slip away. The turning point was the Golden Dome project, a $175 billion defense initiative that the White House presented as a shield against hypersonic threats. In words, it was about the security of the entire continent. In reality, the project was turning into a tool to tie Ottawa to the American military-industrial complex for decades to come.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
The essence of the scheme was simple. The Americans demanded that Canada invest $61 billion in a joint missile defense system. In return, they promised access to technology and protection from an ally. But analysts from the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the real cost of the program for the US would rise to $542 billion over 20 years. This meant that Canada would find itself in the position of a debtor and junior partner, obliged to finance a system whose purpose was not so much to protect the continent as to consolidate American control. Ottawa understood this, and it was here that resistance began. Few in America noticed that the refusal was not simply a matter of budget savings. For Canada, it was an opportunity to declare for the first time in a long time that the country's security could be determined outside Washington. The rejection of the Golden Dome seemed bold and even risky, but it was the first crack in the ice sheet of dependence that had seemed eternal for decades. The media described the event as political theater, but sources claimed that the Canadian government was discussing scenarios for withdrawing from key American programs and creating a parallel defense architecture.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
To understand how revolutionary this decision was, one must recall the history of the Canadian Navy. Since the 1960s, the country had not built its own submarines. Instead, it purchased decommissioned British models. The Victoria-class submarines, which came into Canada's possession in the 1990s, were a particularly sad chapter. These ships were already considered obsolete at the time, and in the years that followed, they became a symbol of military helplessness, constant accidents, leaks, breakdowns, and repairs that were more expensive than operation. Several times, the submarines literally sank before the eyes of engineers in the docks, without even making it to sea. Billions were spent on their maintenance, but the result was humiliating. Washington was well aware of this weakness and used it to keep Ottawa in the role of a dependent ally. That is why Canada's decision to seek new avenues came as a shock to the US. When closed-door negotiations began in Berlin on the supply of new-generation German submarines, the Pentagon perceived this as a betrayal. Type 212 submarines are not outdated British relics, but advanced machines designed specifically for the conditions of the North Sea. They use an air-independent power plant, are capable of remaining hidden under Arctic ice for weeks, and are equipped with modern sonar systems that give them an advantage in shallow waters and in difficult climatic conditions. Moreover, the project included an element of technology transfer, which would allow Canada to establish its own production and reduce its dependence on external supplies. For the US, this meant that for the first time in many decades, its northern neighbor could create a real military-industrial complex capable of operating without looking to Washington.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
American military analysts did not hide their irritation. In closed reports, some of which were leaked to the press, it was pointed out that such a move undermines the foundations of joint defense and creates a threat of a reorientation of the strategic balance in the Arctic. And although the State Department officially stated that it respected the Allies' right to choose their partners, behind the scenes there was talk of unforgivable adventurism. After all, it was not just about military equipment. It was about the principle itself. If Canada is capable of independently choosing arms suppliers and building a defense strategy, then the American monopoly has collapsed. It must be acknowledged that not everything that is happening can be explained solely by economic or security logic. In Canada, dissatisfaction with the role of little brother had been building up for a long time. Humiliating episodes involving the purchase of used ships, constant concessions in trade disputes, and endless tariff wars all created a backdrop for radical decisions. There was a growing demand for independence in society, and although official polls often showed support for the alliance with the US, deep down there was a growing sense of irritation. This was especially true after Donald Trump's loud statements that Canada should accept its role as the 51st state. For many, this was the last straw.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Therefore, negotiations with Europe looked like more than just a commercial deal. It was a symbolic statement. Canada is ready to build a new alliance, even if it angers Washington. The media compared the situation to the TV series Game of Thrones. For a long time, Canada played the role of a loyal vassal, but now it has decided to swear allegiance to another house. For Americans, this was tantamount to betrayal, but for Canadians, it was a historic opportunity to step out of the shadows. We must not forget about the Arctic. Climate change has turned it into an arena for global competition. Russia is actively increasing its presence there with new bases, modernized nuclear submarines, and military exercises in the Northern Sea route. Chinese research vessels equipped with suspiciously large antennas are increasingly appearing off the Canadian coast. In such conditions, dependence on American technology is perceived as a strategic risk. For Ottawa, the new fleet is not only a military tool, but also a political symbol. The country is ready to defend its waters and resources on its own.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
There is talk in NATO circles that Canada's decision could trigger a chain reaction. If even the closest ally of the US has dared to take such a step, what will stop others? Europe has long been dissatisfied with American monopoly in the military sphere, and the emergence of an alternative center of power, uniting Canada and the leading powers of the European Union, looks like a challenge to the established order. Washington understands this, but for now prefers to act cautiously, fearing an open scandal. This is where the main paradox lies. For the US, Canada remains a neighbor whose economy and security are closely linked to its own. But every step Ottawa takes toward independence turns into a political bombshell. The rejection of the Golden Dome and the transition to European submarines are not technical details, but links in a chain that is gradually leading to a split. And while such a scenario seemed impossible in the past, today it is being seriously discussed. Pentagon think tanks are already modeling situations in which Canada acts independently, and sometimes contrary to US interests. The American administration finds itself in a trap. On the one hand, open pressure could push Canada even further away from Washington. On the other hand, inaction could lead to a loss of control over the Arctic and energy flows. That is why the story surrounding the Golden Dome and German submarines has become more than just another budget dispute.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
It is a prologue to the biggest rethinking of North American relations in the last 80 years. The Arctic has long been considered a frozen arena, accessible only to researchers and military strategists. But climate change has turned it into a point of intersection for the interests of the world's major powers. The ice is melting faster than predicted, opening up new trade routes that could change the global logistics map. The Northwest Passage, until recently considered almost mythical, is increasingly becoming navigable, and it is Canada that holds the key to controlling these routes. This is a challenge for Washington, as the US has traditionally claimed a leading role in ensuring the region's security. But now Ottawa is taking steps that increasingly demonstrate its willingness to act independently. Against the backdrop of discussions about new submarines, Canada is launching parallel projects related to energy. Europe, deprived of Russian supplies after the war in Ukraine, is desperately seeking new sources of fuel. Both Canadian gas and oil are becoming the answer to this demand. What was previously perceived as a secondary export channel is now becoming an instrument of global geopolitics. For the first time in decades, contracts are appearing in which the US not only does not participate, but is in fact bypassed. Moreover, the documents stipulate conditions that allow Canada to directly control routes and prices rather than adapting to its neighbors.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
The energy shift is particularly noticeable in the Arctic, where new terminals are being built and projects are planned to liquefy gas directly on the coast. One such project has received support from several European banks, which has set off alarm bells among American analysts. Europe is ready to invest in northern resources, even if it leads to a deterioration in relations with Washington. Economists point out that within the next 10 years, up to a quarter of all Canadian energy supplies could be redirected to Europe and Asia. For the US, this is not just a loss of fuel, but a loss of leverage. At the same time, the military situation is also changing. The Canadian military is increasingly conducting exercises in Arctic waters, which were previously dominated by the American and Russian fleets. Fictional but plausible reports to Parliament estimate that the new routes could bring the country hundreds of billions of dollars in the coming decades. That is why Ottawa is ready to invest billions in defending its Arctic borders. And here a new line of conflict emerges, whereas Canada previously operated as part of the NORAD system. There are now ideas about creating its own early warning systems integrated with European satellites. For the US, this is tantamount to an ally opening up a parallel defense perimeter to which Washington has no access.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Against this backdrop, the whiskey incident erupted, which at first glance looked like a political farce. When the premier of one of the largest provinces publicly poured a bottle of Crown Royal onto the asphalt and called the corporation a bag of stupid decisions on live television, viewers laughed and discussed it as another eccentricity. But within political circles, this event was perceived differently. The gesture became a symbol. It meant that Canada no longer intended to play the role of an obedient economic colony where transnational companies could close factories and lay off people without consequences. Behind this action was a specific conflict. A French corporation had decided to liquidate a plant in Ontario to cut costs, leaving hundreds of workers unemployed. In response, there was a threat to deprive the company of its largest market in North America, the province's alcohol monopoly. This was the first time that an ultimatum had been issued in the public arena. If you close jobs, you lose access to our market. And although the figures seemed simple, save $17 million or lose $740 million in annual sales, the logic itself was much more important. For the first time, a Canadian regional leader used economic tools as a weapon against a transnational corporation and, indirectly, against American pressure. After all, it was the US that was preparing a new package of tariffs against Canada at the time. It turned out that the symbolic gesture with the bottle of whiskey was not an emotional outburst, but a carefully calculated signal to Washington. Canada is ready to strike at economic interests if forced to make concessions. Fictional but realistic details added drama to the situation. In behind-the-scenes negotiations, representatives of the corporation allegedly tried to enlist the support of American diplomats, arguing that the province's decision could set a dangerous precedent for international business. The response was harsh. Intervention in this dispute would only reinforce the argument that Canada must protect its businesses from external pressure. And that is exactly what happened. The conflict went beyond the scope of local economic history and became an element of big politics. Importantly, this episode coincided with the country's energy turnaround. The media even coined the term whiskey moment to describe the point at which a symbolic act on the domestic stage became part of a global strategy. The combination of economic leverage and military initiatives in the Arctic sent a powerful signal. Canada is ready to act independently and defend its interests not only with words but also with deeds. Washington reacted with obvious irritation. Think tanks discussed that if such actions became regular, American corporations would begin to lose ground in a country they had considered a safe haven for decades. For the US, this meant not only economic losses, but also the risk of losing cultural and political influence. When real changes in the energy sector were added to this, the first deliveries of liquefied gas to Asia and contracts with Europe, it became clear that this was no longer a matter of symbolism, but of fundamental transformation.